How have you guys been doing? I know that it's been a long time since I've done anything about, I guess, really anything about Charles Manson at all. I have good reason for that, and I've talked about this before in another video, but to put it this way, I was in a very, very deep depression last year, 2022, after, well, drugs. But I wasn't the one doing them. So anyway, life is a bit better now. And and well, actually, to all of you that have stayed, all of you have stayed, and I'm so surprised. So I want to say thank you. And this video is dedicated to all of you. Not only because I know you guys love this Manson shit, because I do too, but I think you guys will find this to be really fucking interesting. I hope I can still be monetized. Anyway, I'm gonna call this Roses Over the Watson Grave. This is more of a, not necessarily a vlog, but some sort of mixture between true crime, a diary entry, and I guess a vacation. In April of 2023, which so far right now is this year, I went north to the Dallas area of Texas. For reference, I live about an hour or so south of Houston. So this was about a 6-hour trip, at least, for me. I had other plans for going that way, actually. Namely, to see Goatwhore and I Hate God, because they were playing at the Thin Line Fest in Denton. But I figured that since I was going up there, it would be worth going to the final resting place of Tex Watson's parents. I had mostly wanted to go to the cemetery they were listed as being at because I had heard from multiple sources that the Watsons were buried under rather peculiar circumstances. George Stimson's channel and the Manson blog are the sources I thought of in particular that have mentioned this. In an older video of mine, honestly, I just can't remember which one. I think maybe it might have been the book review for Will You Die For Me? Charles Watson's book. Someone commented that the graves of the Watsons' parents were not under rose bushes. And I was confused by this, because the lore, as far as I understand, was that this was so. Sources online have stated / alluded to his parents being buried with their headstones turned upside down, making it difficult to read in passing, and rose bushes covering the headstones on top of that. As it goes, the lore, and I'm just kind of making that up, because I don't know how else you want to call it. Let me know what you think. Should we call this lore or the urban legend? Well, it's not a legend, whatever. Anyway, the mythos within the Manson mythos and the lore of it all, for Charles Watson's parents, at least, his parents were so embarrassed of their son's actions that they didn't want to be recognized, even in death. While I'm unsure how true that technically is, I can definitely believe such a statement, since pictures online paint this image. And I can only think of one picture of his father, and he's definitely nonplussed. The graves are searchable on Find a Grave, with photos of the rose bushes and the reversed headstones. And there actually, a couple of pictures are on the Manson blog where somebody had also did some tourism, probably about 7 years ago from now, whatever, like 2015-ish, of the graves. So I was like, well, it seems to be the truth. That's what the pictures seem to say. But even still, I was curious to see for myself, since for the past few years, since 2019 to now, I've been just immersed in Manson content. Even within the past year, not reading much of shit. I mean, I'm still reading about Manson on my own time. I really am. But anyway, the fact, though, is that someone had told me that the rose bushes over the graves was not true. And this only egged me on, to tell you the truth, to see this place. It was like a challenge, I guess you could say, that I had set for myself in my mind, though the only person I wanted to prove it to was myself. Seeing that I was going to be in the Dallas area anyway, I arranged plans to travel to the Copeville, Farmersville area of Texas, something I had actually wanted to do for years, especially since reading Watson's first book. The journey was over 5 hours, thanks to traffic and my being on the road on a Friday, though the Farmersville area is sort of out of the way from the eastern side of Dallas. So there was some country roads I had to go on, and it was just so fun getting caught up in the after-school traffic. And unrelated, when I was going through the after-school traffic, which freaking sucked, I drove past a neighborhood called Kensington Park, which surely had to have been named after Peter Pan, the whole Peter Pan thing. I thought that it was kind of strange, in a way, for a suburb, considering how Peter Pan, in some regards, is considered a villain, where in some interpretations of the book or the story of Peter Pan, he's actually taking children away, much like the Pied Piper. But anyway, I suppose it's apt, though, considering I was doing some morbid tourism where multiple parents had their children taken away from them. I would also like to point out, though unrelated, that on this trip back and forth, I saw 19 Dollar Generals. My fucking God. Anyway, my destination, though, was Thompson Cemetery, which is listed as being in Lavin or Lavon, Texas. I have no idea how to formally pronounce it, but I just call it Lavin, where, I don't know, there's just something about being in Texas and somewhere you think it would be pronounced, it's probably pronounced the other way. Like, for example, there used to be a town called Navidad. You would think it would be Navidad, but no, anyway, my point is, Thompson Cemetery, Lavin, Texas. Texas is a pretty interesting place, with many towns named after, well, popular cities or even countries from around the world, or maybe even around its own country, you know? And this area was no different. Thompson Cemetery is right next to a town called Nevada, Texas, and in some maps it might be listed as being in Nevada, Texas, but anyway, the cemetery is approximately around there through GPS. Other places in Texas named after other places include Paris, Texas, China, Texas, Italy, Texas, which is actually pronounced Italy, Palestine, Texas, which is potentially named after Palestine, Illinois, Shanghai, Texas, which is actually a ghost town that's mostly been absorbed into the Pierce and Wharton area. Athens, Texas, which, yes, is named after Athens, Greece. Moscow, Texas, Washington, Texas, Los Angeles, Texas, and so many more. Anyway, Thompson Cemetery is south of Copeville, Texas. When I was reaching the area, it was dark and stormy. Seriously, I'm not making that up. It was really dark and stormy, and black clouds were rolling in, despite it only being about 4 o'clock. I almost completely drove past the cemetery as the bad weather hid the non-assuming area. It looked like something, well, a cemetery just like any other. Nothing stood out like a red flag or something shouting, "Oh, hey, Tex Watson's parents are here." Nah, there wasn't any indication of their final resting place really at all. And just in regular life, you wouldn't have ever thought that there would be at least two people unintentionally connected to the Tate LaBianca murders. Before making my drive up there, I had done some research on the cemetery and tried to dig into the Watson family tree. It's rather elusive, and I'll have to go into detail of that in a completely separate blog post, which might be a multi-video series. But from what I understand, Tex's parents are the only immediate ones from his family buried there. I don't know where his brother and sister are, if they are even still alive, and if they aren't, I don't know where they're buried. But I can definitely say that they were not buried there, when I was at the location at least, in April 2023. And it appears that there might not have been, they might not have been in that area for that general area for a while, potentially decades even. The Thompson Cemetery seems to be kind of like a family grave of sorts for Tex's maternal side of the family. Many of the people there do share lineage with him, but and even some of the last names actually that were in the book, "Will You Die For Me," like Montgomery was one of them, which stuck out to me most. A lot of those names, basically, that maternal side was definitely still existing there today. There were various surnames on the metal fence that was at the front of the cemetery, including Webb, though I don't recall seeing Watson, but it was really dark when I got there. So I believe when I took a picture, I was like, oh, there's Watson right there. Anyway, there was one historical marker at the entrance of the cemetery, which was dated from 1983. A note about the markers. In the state of Texas, there's these things called Texas historical markers, which are these landmark-esque signs that are petitioned for the area's local historical commission, and typically the historical commission will write a note about the history of the landmark, usually how old the area is, and of course why it's important. The Thompson Cemetery marker stated that the area of Collin County, Texas, was settled on or around 1850 by a man named Abner Thompson. The land was settled on what was originally part of the Sylvester Williams Survey, which deeded a portion to be used as the cemetery. The first burial was actually Abner Thompson himself, which took place in 1852. The grave is marked with two large square stones which have deteriorated through time and have become nearly illegible tall posts of bow dark, which mark the nearby grave of one of Thompson's employees, having stood the effects of weathering for more than 100 years. Also buried here are Miles and Emily J. Graves, who in 1862 donated over an acre of land to the Mount Pleasant Baptist Church, which was organized 5 years earlier when the congregation divided in the early 1880s. That land was given to the Thompson Cemetery, which was enlarged several more times in later years. A memorial day service has been held at the Thompson Cemetery each year since the early 1950s, bringing together people from the nearby communities of Lavin and Copeville. There are over 800 graves here, which are given perpetual care by the Thompson Cemetery Association. dated 1983. I don't know today how many people are actually buried there, though I'm sure it's more than 800. And I was there at the end of April, which was right before Memorial Day. So I don't know if in 2023 they did the Memorial Day celebration again, or if they have done it since, 2020. Anyway, it was during this moment, though, that I was reading that historical marker, and there was this loud clap of thunder and booming down. It just started to pour rain. I grabbed my umbrella and camera, feeling like I was part of some sort of 1998 movie or something. I really did. And I was just struck. I was struck by the line of illegible tall posts of Bodark. It was a strange feeling for me that all these things have been coming together in my life. I'd been doing a lot of soul searching, as you would call it. I had to go through a lot of spiritual healing after the events of 2022. I felt I was in such a deep depression, and I felt so worthless for this past year of my life. And then things started coming together. And this was one of them. Seeing illegible posts of Bodark on the sign, it gave me the strange feeling that a cycle in my life was somehow becoming complete in some way. It gave me the feeling that, honestly, I felt like I had been there before, like a vibration with the earth that I felt in my heart. It was so strange to me, that word, though exciting too. At one point in time, when life was a lot easier, or at least wasn't so complicated, and before the happy things turned sad, I used to live on a street called Bodark, a French term about a type of orange tree, which curiously, at that house I lived at on Bodark, had a flowering orange tree at it too. No matter which way you see it, I truly believed that I needed to see that. And I guess I was in the right place at the right time, for once in my life. I set out to go looking for the Watsons, which seemed like a daunting task at over 800 graves in the cemetery. I got in my car, parking at the back of the cemetery. I mostly wanted to be out of the way in case anyone else came by and was wondering what I was doing. Granted, I was just paying my respects, but there's always this part of me that's anxious someone will come by and ask why I'm taking pictures of a cemetery. So far, that's not the case, thankfully. But in general, I think that we all see going to a cemetery as a private experience, where none of us have to explain why we're there to anybody. That's probably just my anxiety brain being afraid of someone asking why I'm doing this. But at the same time, too, when I can, I actually do try to go to local cemeteries around me, because there's people on Find a Grave who will wish for or request a photo of what's typically their loved ones. And so, I don't know, it's always rewarding for me to do that for other people, because I know that it helps with family trees a lot. On top of that, I try to find any headstones that I suspect may not be on Find a Grave, because sometimes they're just very old. And there's gravestones that, even to this day, that still haven't been categorized anywhere. It happens. I've encountered very old headstones that weren't online anywhere, despite being easily over 100, 130, 150 plus years old. It's strange how some people can be missed, even to this day, despite large passages of time. Going to cemeteries, I always pay my respects and ensure to be respectful. I have the following rules when I go to a cemetery. 1. Don't disturb what has not been disturbed. 2. Respect every grave, old and new. 3. Don't take anything. Do not take anything. 4. Remember that these are all real people who were alive at some point in time. Real families. And they might even still have people that visit him to this day. 5. Take note of any broken headstones. Take pictures, just in case. Hopefully the individual can be identified. 6. Gently and tenderly brush away any dirt or brush on a headstone, just to ensure that the person can be identified. Very often you'll come across headstones that just because of nature, maybe even animals, you'll find dirt kind of covering the names or most of a name, and other times, grass or any sort of flora will just overgrow. So I try what I can, though if I'm really thinking about it, I would probably bring some shears with me. But if I can, I try to wipe away what I can. Just anything to help, but not to destroy, And finally, do not sit on any of the graves. I know that it might be different in other places, like, I don't know, I guess cemeteries in New Orleans are above ground, so you could probably look at that differently, but at least over here where I go, there's kind of your stereotypical ones. But even still, to me, I think it's very disrespectful to sit on somebody's headstone. Hanging out at the back of the cemetery, I saw what looked like an expansive yet creepy sort of kind of residence or something around the property line. It reminded me of some sort of Texas Chainsaw stuff. Granted, that's probably because I was at a cemetery, which it's always kind of creepy and eerie at a cemetery, no matter which way you put it or even what time of day it is. With the pouring rain and looking at the graves, especially the ones from the 19th century, I couldn't help but think of those movie scenes before the zombies crawl themselves out of the ground, thinking kind of a, Turn of the Living Dead or even Night of the Living Dead. I came across a tombstone that was broken looking. It looked like it fell backward on the ground. Sometimes old graves will become brittle at the base and fall backwards. It's hard to make out the name of that person in particular, but usually thinking of it now, it's always hard to make out the names of course, the broken headstones. And that actually makes me feel pretty sad. There's not much I guess you can do about it, except for potentially contact maybe like the cemetery master, if there's even anyone to contact. This person I'm talking about in particular, though, only seemed to have lived for about 10 years, from 1870 to 1880. There's definitely a shift in the age group, I would say. That's what I'm trying to say, of people that were buried between, of course, the 19th century and the 20th century. You'll find a lot more graves from the 19th century that are of children. than you would from the 20th century. It's very sad, but and that's one of the biggest reasons why I always try to be as respectful as I can, because God forbid you break something and it was a stillborn's grave. But anyway, I took pictures of the other graves that were around, some of the broken ones mainly. A lot of the old 100-plus-year-old ones were actually broken in half. I'm not sure if any of the descendants of these people are still in the area, though I realize that the headstones are expensive in general to replace. I looked to find what I thought was the Watsons' graves, this square area with lots of foliage, but it wasn't them. I saw a Watson, though I don't believe that there was any relation to the Watsons I was looking for in general. And I think I forgot to write this down, but I do want to say that when I looked on Find a Grave, it seems that Tex's paternal side seems to have been buried mostly on the west side of Texas, West Texas, the dry desert side that everybody thinks of stereotypically. So I circled back, though, to the front of the cemetery, almost thinking that maybe his parents weren't buried there after all. Manually, I checked the names of the graves I passed by, and I finally found them. I just went and I looked one by one. Sometimes you've just got to do it like that. At the front part of the left side was where the Watsons were hidden. Hidden in plain sight. Just like they wanted, I guess. What actually caught my eye about their graves is how they looked like tombs. Everyone else just had the stone, but the Watsons had the long stones encompassing them. There were only a handful of other people buried like this, and usually this style is something I've seen used for veterans, namely those from the Vietnam War and World War II. As far as I know, Tex's father never served, though if he ever did, it wasn't marked anywhere on the grave. Ironically, the way they ended up being buried still brought some sort of attention to them, just from being different than a usual headstone. I can't help but wonder why the Watsons were buried at the front of the cemetery. If they were so ashamed, even to death, shouldn't they have... Wouldn't it have made sense to be put in the back of the cemetery? There was plenty of empty, unmarked land and graves that I never passed through. But at the same time, too, when they both passed away, it might have been all that was available at the time, because I am familiar with people buying plots years, decades ahead. The rain had stopped by this time, and I just stood in front of the graves, taking it all in. I don't know if I implied the feeling, but looking down at Charles's parents, I felt an air of sadness. It just seemed so sad there, at that spot. Whether that sadness was truly my own, I don't know, though I have heard that sometimes tragedy transcends our living beings and carries on for many uncounted days. For example, a friend of mine told me that he had went to see Dachau. It was completely quiet. There was absolute silence when he went there, not even the chirping of birds. I felt a similar sort of energy from the graves of Watson's parents, though it was just one emotion, a deep and unending void of sadness. Looking over at the head of the graves, there was only one bush, one rose bush intact. The bush that had been placed at his father's grave was still there, blooming and filled with hot pink roses. The bush seemed to be trimmed in height from older pictures that made both seem actually really, really tall. I noticed that the bush that once stood over his mother's grave was no longer there, having been cut down at some point in time, though it looked rather recently, maybe within the past 2 years. I don't know why her roses might have been cut down, but as of April 2023, they were not there. So, to answer the question of, are there rose bushes covering the Watson parents' graves? The answer to that is both yes and no. His father's grave? Yes. His mother's? No. For reasons I don't know of, hers was cut down. So to that person from a couple of years ago, I guess we were both right. I stood over Clarence Watson's grave, and all I could think to say was, I'm sorry.